Imagine standing in a forest so vast that the trees seem to touch the clouds. Towering giants, some over 250 feet tall, with trunks so wide that they could dwarf a person. Now picture those same trees, cut, hauled, and stacked in lumberyards, so massive that they look like wooden skyscrapers. This was Seattle during the height of the lumber boom, a city shaped by its forests, its sawmills, and its relentless drive to turn nature's bounty into profit. In the 1800s, the Pacific Northwest was home to some of the largest trees on Earth, including cedar, hemlock, spruce, and the iconic Douglas fir. Settlers who came to this region saw it not just for its landscape, but its opportunity. Timber became the livelihood of Seattle's economy, and the city quickly earned a reputation as the gateway to the Northwest, fueling expansion across the United States. But what happened to this incredible industry? How did a city so synonymous with lumberyards lose its place as a timber titan? And what traces of this forgotten era still remain in Seattle today? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the history of Seattle's forgotten lumberyards. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start with one basic fact. Seattle is the northernmost major city in the lower 48. It's also located in Washington, the northwesternmost state in the lower 48, bordered by Canada to the north and the Pacific Ocean to the west. Seattle itself sits on a narrow piece of land nestled between the saltwater expanse of Puget Sound and the freshwater Lake Washington, giving it a unique strategic location for both transportation and commerce. The area we now call Seattle has a human history stretching back thousands of years. Archaeologists believe the region has been continuously inhabited for at least 12,000 years, starting with the descendants of people who crossed a land bridge from Siberia into North America during the Ice Age. Over a millennia, these people evolved into the tribes we recognize today. These tribes established sophisticated societies with economies based on fishing, hunting, and trading. They maintained a deep spiritual connection to the land. However, when European settlers arrived, the long-established Native American way of life was profoundly disrupted. Colonization brought dramatic changes to the Puget Sound area, diminishing native influence through forced displacement, disease, and conflict. Anyhow, before Seattle became a city, the Pacific Northwest was already a topic of great interest to the majority of global powers. For example, in 1818, the US and Britain agreed to joint occupation of the Oregon Country, an area that included modern-day Washington. For decades, the two nations vied for control over this resource-rich region. Finally, in 1846, the Treaty of Oregon was signed, officially establishing the 49th parallel as the boundary between the United States and British Canada. Surprisingly, this border remains in use to this very day. Once the borders were in place, the first permanent European settlers arrived to the area in 1851, establishing a settlement they called New York Alki. The name was a curious blend of aspirations. New York was a nod to the ambition of building a significant port city, while Alki derived from Chinook jargon, roughly translating to by and by, or someday, reflecting their hopes for the future. By 1852, the settlement moved to the eastern shore of Elliot Bay, a location better suited for shipping and trade. And it was this new settlement that they named Seattle, in honor of Chief Sealth, a respected leader who fostered relationships between the natives and settlers. This name marked the beginning of a complex legacy intertwining the area's indigenous and settlers' history. Anyhow, in 1853, just 1 year after the settlement was established on Elliot Bay, Henry Yesler built Seattle's very first lumber mill. This mill became the cornerstone of the city's economy, processing the towering trees of the Pacific Northwest into valuable timber for construction. Yesler's mill not only supplied the growing towns around Puget Sound, but also sent lumber as far south as San Francisco, fueling the growth of yet another bustling port city. From its earliest days, Seattle began building its reputation as a major hub for the lumber industry. By the early 20th century, the forests of the Pacific Northwest were a vital resource for the nation. In fact, the coastal forests were home to about 2/3 of the timber in the U.S. as late as 1919, nearly 70 years after settlers began logging in the area. Washington state alone boasted the largest concentration of soft trees in the world, including Douglas fir, western hemlock, and red cedar, species prized for their strength and versatility. Seattle's location and access to waterways made it a natural hub for timber trade. Logs were transported via rivers and floated to mills, then shipped to cities across the country and beyond. The timber industry not only shaped Seattle's economy, but also transformed its landscape, laying the groundwork for the city's rapid growth and establishing its early identity as a lumber capital. As the 1890s approached, Washington was on the cusp of a transformation, solidifying its place as a leader in the timber industry. Washington had only just become a state in 1889, yet the lumber trade was already a cornerstone of its economy. By this time, about 1/3 of Washington's population was employed in the timber industry, and surprisingly, as the demand for timber surged into the 20th century, the industry grew even larger. By 1910, nearly 2/3 of the state's workforce were involved in some aspect of lumber production, from felling trees to operating mills. And of course, with such a production-heavy industry, finding ways to transport the product was critical. The first step in the log transportation route was the processing yard. Yarding involved moving logs from the site where they were cut to a loading area, where they could be hauled to a mill or processing plant. The methods used for yarding involved significant manpower and overtime, yet at this point, the technological advancements were a major improvement as compared to the early days, when oxen were the workhorses of the industry, literally. These powerful animals could lug enormous logs over uneven terrain, a task far beyond the strength of human labor alone. Oxen were reliable, strong, and less likely to be stolen, making them indispensable to early logging operations. However, by the late 19th century, horses began to replace oxen as the primary animals for yarding. While not as strong as oxen, horses were more agile and easier to maneuver in dense forest environments. Their intelligence and responsiveness allowed loggers to work faster and more efficiently. In some cases, mules were also used, but their role was more limited compared to the dominant use of oxen and horses. In the 1880s, the timber industry took a leap forward with the introduction of a revolutionary mechanical tool, the steam donkey. Also known as the donkey engine, this mobile machine used steam power to pull logs using cables and a reel. Steam donkeys were a game changer as they could move far more logs than animals ever could. The increased power and efficiency of these machines allowed loggers to harvest massive trees that were previously too challenging to transport, an innovation that marked the beginning of a shift away from animal labor towards mechanized logging. Beyond yarding, transporting logs over long distances posed another significant challenge. You see, early logging operations prioritized cutting down trees near waterways so that logs could be floated downstream to mills. This method, known as log driving, was efficient and cost-effective, provided that the logging site was near a river or stream. Hence, many sawmills were strategically built downstream to take advantage of this natural transportation network. However, as loggers cleared the forest near waterways, they had to venture further inland, requiring new transportation solutions. This is where railroads became invaluable. Logging crews often constructed temporary railroads to transport logs from remote forests to permanent rail lines or mills. These makeshift tracks were disassembled and moved as logging operations advanced into new areas. But then, by the 1920s, trucks began to replace railroads for many logging operations. Trucks could navigate roads that were impractical for rails, offering even greater flexibility. Even so, once logs reached their final overland destination, they were often still disposed into boom ponds, which are large bodies of water where logs are collected before being floated downstream to mills. This method mirrored the earlier practices of log driving along rivers, but allowed for greater control over the process. However, even water-based transportation had its own challenges. For example, log jams were a frequent and serious problem. These blockages occurred when logs became stuck in rivers or boom ponds, creating massive backups that halted production altogether. For example, in February of 1926, a logjam on the Kalman River trapped an estimated 5 million board feet of lumber. Such events were costly and time-consuming to resolve, as they required teams of workers to manually dislodge the tangled logs. Lumberyards had their own distinct culture, shaped by unique challenges but also camaraderie. In the sometimes isolated lumber camps, workers relied on a sense of community and routine to get through their grueling days. Meals were a critical part of camp life, typically served in a cookhouse. These meals weren't just about sustenance, they were moments of reprieve. Prepared mostly by male cooks, meals were hearty to fuel workers who often spent up to 10 hours a day chopping down trees. Common dishes included baked beans, hash, potatoes, and coffee. Simple, yet energy-packed foods that sustained the intense physical labor. However, while most meals offered some comfort, the sleeping conditions left much to be desired. Workers bunked in crowded, unclean quarters, known as bunkhouses. Hygiene was minimal, and rest was rarely restorative. By 1905, there were nearly 8,000 lumber workers employed in King County alone, and their living conditions became part of a growing national conversation about labor rights and workplace standards. The work itself was as dangerous as it was demanding. Cutting down a single tree could sometimes take over 4 days, requiring skill, teamwork, and persistence. And those who took on the daunting task of felling these giants were called fallers. Fallers used axes to carve small notches or dives into the side of trees. Into these notches, they wedged so-called sturdy boards, creating platforms high above the ground. These platforms gave them better leverage to access the narrow upper portion of the tree trunk. From there, they worked in teams using cross-cut saws, long, flexible blades operated by 2 people to bring down the towering trees. By the 1920s, new techniques began to emerge, and it didn't take long for companies to start employing high riggers, specialized workers who climbed trees to remove upper branches and brush. Wearing spiked climbing shoes and secured with climbing belts, these riggers scaled trees as tall as 180 feet. Once at the top, they cleared the upper portion of the tree and attached cables, which later helped speed up the process of transporting the logs to the loading zone. These lumberyards and mills provide a fascinating window into the history of not only Seattle's lumber industry, but the broader labor struggles of American industrial expansion. Take, for example, the Lake Union Lumber and Manufacturing Company, founded in 1882 along the shores of Lake Union. This company was one of the most prominent players in Seattle's early timber industry, operating even before Washington achieved statehood in 1889. From 1884 to 1895, the mill was managed by David Denny, a notable early settler of Seattle. Under Denny's leadership, the mill became a significant hub for processing the region's abundant timber. This lumberyard was located near what is now the northern end of Mercer Street, while the mill itself stood at the modern-day intersection of Westlake Avenue and Republican Street. In 1895, Denny leased the mill to John S. Brace and Frank Hergert, who eventually purchased it outright in 1899. But it wasn't meant to be. Disaster struck in 1909 when a fire engulfed the entire mill. A nightmare scenario for lumber operations in general. Fire was one of the greatest hazards of the timber industry, given the flammable nature of the product and the lack of advanced firefighting technology of the day. Despite the setback, the mill was rebuilt and operations continued under Brace and Hergert until they sold it to the Stimson Timber Company in 1921. Stimson ran the mill until the 1930s, when changes in the industry and economy signaled a shift in Seattle's priorities. The Brace family retained the land south of Valley Street, where they continued to operate the Brace Lumber Company. However, by the late 1960s, this property was acquired by the city of Seattle as a part of the plan to construct the Bay Freeway, which would pass south of Lake Union. By this point in American history, the focus was shifting to the automobile, signaling a new era of priorities and progress. This downturn was driven by a variety of interconnected factors, each playing a crucial role in the industry's unraveling. One of the most contentious reasons for the downfall of this industry was environmental impact, which came to the forefront with the passing of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. But it's argued that this act was too little too late, as by 1990, for example, the northern spotted owl was officially listed as endangered, prompting the development of a comprehensive conservation strategy to protect its habitat. This new strategy introduced extreme regulations on timber harvesting, particularly in old-growth forests, which were vital to the owl's survival. Organizations like the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service enforced these new protections, limiting the availability of harvestable land. For many loggers, these restrictions were not just inconvenient, they were existential threats to their livelihoods. The loggers community expressed their frustration through slogans like, "Save a logger, not an owl." Yet the northern spotted owl was only one part of a much larger story. Beyond the environmental regulations, the mechanization of logging and advanced technology in the area had begun to reshape the industry. By the mid-20th century, the widespread adaptation of the chainsaw drastically reduced the number of workers needed to fell trees. While the first electric chainsaw was introduced in 1926, it wasn't until decades later that chainsaws became standard in logging operations, transforming what had been a highly labor-intensive process into something faster and far less reliant on human power. This technological shift meant fewer jobs in the field, as machines took over the tasks that once required entire teams of loggers. Many workers who were displaced blamed environmental protections like those for the northern spotted owl, but the reality was that automation had been silently eroding job opportunities for years. In many ways, it was easier to direct their frustration towards a tangible symbol, like the owl, than it was to confront the broader, inevitable march of industrial innovation. A story which perhaps we're going to see all over again with the rise of AI. Anyhow, the Pacific Northwest timber industry also faced growing competition from other regions and countries. Emerging markets for wood production in places like Alberta, Canada, and Georgia meant that the once dominant forests of Washington and Oregon were no longer unrivaled. Furthermore, improved global transportation networks allowed lumber to be exported and imported across vast distances. At the same time, local timber was increasingly shipped to mills outside the U.S., adding strain to domestic processing plants. This globalization of the wood trade made it hard for the Pacific Northwestern mills to compete, leading to closure and further job losses. The scale of these challenges wasn't lost on the industry leaders. George Weyerhaeuser, a prominent figure in the Weyerhaeuser Timber Company, captured the uncertainty of the time in a statement from 1986, reading, quote, "We are weathering a revolutionary restructuring that is shaking the forest products industry in the Pacific Northwest. Depressed prices and stiff competition leave the company with no alternative but to seek a substantial reduction in labor costs. So we will be seeking wage and benefit reductions." This stark admission highlighted the profound economic pressures facing the industry. With falling prices, shrinking profit margins, and rising global competition, even well-established companies struggled to adapt. For workers, this meant not only wage cuts, but also the loss of the stable, well-paying jobs that had once been a hallmark of the timber industry. The decline of the lumber trade wasn't just about economics or policy. It was the end of an era for an industry that had shaped the identity of the entire Pacific Northwest for over a century. Although the Pacific Northwest and Seattle have faced substantial challenges and setbacks in the timber industry, logging and forest-related businesses remain integral to the region's economy. While the scale and methods have changed dramatically over time, Washington State continues to play a major role in the industry. Today, forest products hold the title of the third largest manufacturing industry in Washington. Logging jobs, though fewer than during the industry's peak, still exist and are set to reflect a blend of traditional methods as well as modern innovation. These days, the focus has shifted towards tree farms, nursery, and sustainable forestry practices that cater to both local but also global demands. In Seattle, tree farms and nurseries like Big Tree Supply provide a wide range of tree species suited to the unique climate of the Pacific Northwest. Remarkably, despite over a century of logging, the area now hosts around 1,500 tree species, which is a sharp contrast to the handful of native species that were present when European settlers first arrived. And it's not accidental. This diversification reflects years of effort, ensure that the tree industry remains viable. And viable it is. In fact, the state is the second largest producer of lumber in the U.S. and accounts for 25% of the nation's lumber exports. This success stems from the fact that nearly half of Washington's total land area remains forested, and according to some sources, supply is still abundant. And with that, we conclude our exploration of Seattle's historic lumberyards. But if you enjoyed this story, you don't want to miss our episode on California's lost forests. This story is going to shock you, and you can watch it right now by clicking here. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.